320 Americans died. July 17, 1944, the Port Chicago disaster. Was it a nuclear explosion? By Daisy Herndon. According to a local newspaper, most victims were atomized. American nuclear deception. Why is nobody talking about this? 320 Americans died.
The Port Chicago disaster, was it a nuclear explosion? That ridiculous question, posed by independent scholar Peter Vogel 40 years ago, was the cover story of the spring 1982 edition of the Black Scholar, one of the nation's oldest scholarly journals of Black culture and political thought. The edition was edited by Robert Allen, Professor Emeritus of UC Berkeley and author of the Port Chicago Mutiny. In one edition of his books, Allen reports that Vogel later withdrew the theory for lack of proof. Although he may have made that temporary move at some point, Vogel continued his research for over 35 years, updating his findings in an online ebook, The Last Wave from Port Chicago. But in December 2018, the senior independent scholar closed down his website, citing personal reasons, including other interests. For his diligent scholarly quest to understand and explain the documented connection between the Manhattan Project and the Port Chicago explosion, Vogel received no honor. One biographer referred to him as a glory-seeking historical revisionist, and in the lengthy discussion that led to his work being deleted from the crowdsourced encyclopedia Wikipedia, one editor called him a crackpot. Others labeled him a conspiracy theorist. But the editors were wrong about one thing. The theory has not been debunked because it has never been officially investigated. The Last Wave from Port Chicago, Vogel's book, was the only comprehensive study of the Port Chicago nuclear explosion theory until now. I flatter myself to think that perhaps after we exchanged emails in the summer and fall of 2018, the senior scholar was able to take comfort in the fact that his work has not been in vain. The Port Chicago nuclear explosion theory is itself a fact of history. It was deleted from Wikipedia, obliterated from the pages of the crowdsourced magazine as if it never existed, but it does. The theory is mentioned, albeit with dismissive sneers, in books about the Manhattan Project and websites about the Port Chicago explosion. Without a valid, serious, evidence-based investigation, twisted versions of the story continue to resurface in social media under sensational headlines like "Black Sailors Nuked." Vogel, who once took a class with Manhattan Project physicist Edward Teller and interviewed him for his book, covered technical details like the size of the crater, the availability of uranium in 1944, the nature of the Wilson condensation cloud, and much more. Now, to be frank, his dense and scientific emphasis made it hard for me to draw any definitive conclusions about his theory. But Vogel was onto something. I just had yet to be convinced that there was any merit to his theory of a nuclear explosion at Port Chicago. I had all the same objections that anyone else would have without looking at the evidence. Now, my own research looks at very different aspects of the question. In my books, American Nuclear Deception and Designed for Large Explosions, I examine a great deal of new, surprising, and wide-ranging evidence. I reinterpret old historical documents concerning the bomb through the lens of the PCNet, the Port Chicago nuclear explosion theory. This evidence focuses on people who played key roles in the creation of the bomb, but have been either overlooked, downplayed, or hidden in the traditional history. People like President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, after all, single-handedly, unilaterally authorized the creation of the bomb. Vannevar Bush, his sire of science, who oversaw the Manhattan Project. Alexander Sachs, the Wall Street banker, who was his advisor on the bomb project. William S. Parsons, the Navy captain who was in charge of ordnance for the Manhattan Project. And Albert Einstein, whose role in regarding the bomb has yet to be thoroughly explored. And Vogel's question has yet to receive a definitive answer. There's been no official investigation of the provocative, outlandish, outrageous, and yet plausible theory that the July 17, 1944 explosion at the Port Chicago Naval Ammunition Depot near San Francisco, California, was a secret test of an atomic bomb conducted under the auspices of the top secret Manhattan Project. I know. A conspiracy theory until you look at the evidence, in which case it becomes the theory of a conspiracy. Think about it. The Manhattan Project, we herald it as an exemplary, as an example of one of the greatest accomplishments in human history, a feat of scientific achievement. We say there should be a Manhattan Project for climate change, all the while forgetting that the key to the Manhattan Project was its secrecy. Not from other nations. The Manhattan Project was secret from the American people. And that is part of its legacy, and the legacy of the history of the bomb, and the legacy that becomes even more clear and more important when looked at through the lens of the Port Chicago nuclear explosion theory. In recent years, scholars, journalists, and panels of investigators have made several surprising discoveries about the early history of the bomb. In Nuclear Statecraft, History and Strategy in America's Atomic Age, for example, Francis J. Gavin points out how little we actually know about our nuclear history. And then there's The Age of Hiroshima, edited by Michael D. Gordon and John Eikenberry. And in that book, 17 contributors address the flawed history of the bomb, and they note that the familiar story was based on too many assumptions and leaves too many questions unanswered. And my research shows that those assumptions and those unanswered questions were partly by design, because the people who wrote or who drafted the initial story of the bomb, after all, were the people who produced the weapon, and they had the reasons to tell the story the way they wanted it told. According to the Smithsonian documentary Atomic Age Declassified, a new history is emerging as previously unexamined documents come to light. Of course, not all of the history was documented and filed neatly in files where it can be discovered. A 2010 study by the Center for Disease Control and the Los Alamos National Laboratory revealed the multi-generational impact of the nuclear testing on the downwinders. Those are the citizens of New Mexico who were exposed to radioactive fallout after the famous Trinity test. They were excluded from receiving compensation under the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, of 1990, which is about to expire in July 2022. Concluding their 2021 article, July 2021 article, Downwind of Trinity, Remembering the First Victims of the Atomic Bomb, Catherine Lead and Maggie O'Brien made a poignant appeal On the 76th anniversary of the Trinity test, they wrote, "We must remember and reflect upon the stories of the downwinders, the first victims of the atomic age." Or perhaps the second victims. From the surprising and wide-ranging evidence I uncovered in my independent investigation of the Port Chicago nuclear explosion theory, three things have become abundantly clear. One, we don't know what we don't know about the history of the bomb, which means that we don't know what we don't know about current nuclear policy. So what we don't know is killing us. It's costing us. It's costing us today. Because, number three, both physically and politically, literally and metaphorically speaking, we are all downwinders. We are all victims of the bomb. The threat of nuclear war is only one small, relatively small part of the impact of the bomb project, the creation of the bomb, the use of the bomb, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and the physical and political fallout that the whole world has experienced. The bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but the nuclear age was dropped on the entire world. The world's first nuclear explosion, that is, the world's first known nuclear explosion, was the famous Trinity test conducted at Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 16, 1945. That was the day the world entered the nuclear age, so far as we know. The early morning blast lit up the sky for miles around. Now, to divert the attention of local residents who experienced various immediate aspects from the secret test, including a blind woman who saw the light 50 miles away, Manhattan Project Director Leslie R. Groves issued a false press release reporting an explosion, get this, at a remote ammunition depot. In July 1945, Manhattan Project leaders used the idea of an explosion at a remote ammunition depot as a cover for a secret nuclear test. Keep that in mind. No one was injured in the fake explosion, of course. By contrast, however, 320 Americans were killed and 390 civilians and military personnel injured, many of them seriously, in a real explosion at a remote naval ammunition magazine near San Francisco, California, exactly 1 year earlier, on July 17, 1944. July 16, 1945, Trinity. July 17, 1944, the Port Chicago explosion. The massive explosion at the Port Chicago Naval Ammunition Depot, 364 days before the Trinity test, was the greatest home front disaster of World War II. It registered 3.5 on the Richter scale. It was felt as far away as Nevada, and it is still listed as one of the greatest man-made explosions in history. The pier was destroyed, along with the two ships docked there. The SS Keynote Victory had arrived earlier that day and was waiting to be loaded for her maiden voyage, where she would carry ammunition to the South Pacific. The 439-foot Victory ship was tossed into the air, spun around, and snapped in half. Now, photos show its two halves standing upended in the Suisun Bay. The SSEA Bryan, a Liberty ship bearing 4,600 tons of explosives, was obliterated. Yes, it had 4,600 tons of explosives. We'll get back to that. A few smoldering pieces of red-hot iron, all that was left of the E.A. Bryan, were found embedded in the sidewalk in the town of Port Chicago, a mile away, where every building in town was damaged and many of the residents injured. Of the 320 people killed in the explosion, 202 were African-American sailors loading ammunition onto the ships bound for the war in the South Pacific. only 51 bodies could be found intact. A local newspaper reported that most victims were atomized. Atomized. Yet, the Port Chicago disaster is best known as the story of the Port Chicago Mutiny. 3 weeks after the blast, some of the black sailors refused to load ammunition onto ships, citing fear of another explosion. Now, they did not go through PTSD training. They did not have any counselors come in. And, well, they had some dances that were thrown for them, but they were not prepared to deal with the tragedy of seeing their fellow sailors atomized. 3 weeks after the blast, some refused to load ammunition. They cited fear of another explosion. Many people think that many people who know about the Port Chicago Mutiny think that the sailors were protesting the racist conditions at the base, but they could have done that before the explosion. No, they were afraid. They said they were afraid. That was their defense. I'm getting ahead of myself. They were threatened. The commandant of the 12th Naval District, Rear Admiral Carlton Wright, he praised them in the immediate aftermath of the explosion for the way that they handled themselves. But when they refused to load ammunition, he told them that they were cowards. And he threatened them. He told them that if they did not load ammunition, they could face the death penalty. And he would see to it that they would face the death penalty for mutiny in time of war. Death penalty. Maybe another explosion. Firing squad. Maybe another explosion. Of the 328 sailors who originally refused to load ammunition, most of them went back to work. 258 or 200, it depends on which document you read, went back to work. 50 stood their ground. They are known as the Port Chicago 50. The court-martial of the Port Chicago 50 was the greatest mass trial in U.S. naval history. A mass trial. They were tried all at once, and it was the greatest mass trial in U.S. history. The Navy, uncharacteristically, publicized the military tribunal. Now, military tribunals are military. They don't follow the rules of civil courts, and they are usually closed to the public. But in this case, the Navy published the information about it and even invited the participation of the NAACP. The NAACP Chief Counsel, Thurgood Marshall, who later became the first African-American Supreme Court Justice, flew out from New York to California to observe the trial. Now, he concluded that the mass court-martial was a frame-up designed, he said, to discredit the African-American sailors. He wrote an appeal on behalf of the Port Chicago 50, one of his few unsuccessful legal briefs, but he may have been onto something when he said the case was a frame-up, not necessarily to discredit the sailors. There were several fishy things about the trial. For example, on October 24th, 1944, after deliberating for only 80 minutes, which included lunch, the court found each of the 50 sailors guilty of conspiracy to commit mutiny. Conspiracy to commit mutiny. During the trial, the attorney for the defense raised the question of what constituted a mutiny in the first place, that there was no violence whatsoever, no attempted or planned takeover. The sailors even agreed to obey any order except to load ammunition onto ships. And after the war, most of them were released from jail and reassigned to duty, which is a striking turn of events for men who were convicted of a crime that carried the potential of the death penalty. They did serve prison time on the charge, though, and the crime remained on their records until they their deaths. One, Freddie Meeks, was pardoned by President Clinton in 1999. The others most of them had already passed by that time, but the ones who were still alive refused a pardon. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't want a pardon. And there have been ongoing efforts to address the perceived injustice. A bill to exonerate the Port Chicago 50 passed the U.S. Congress in September 2021. It's still awaiting final adjudication. One of the oddest things about the mass trial, seldom talked about, if ever, is the simple fact that no court-martial was necessary. According to naval regulations, refusing to obey an order is grounds for discharge without honor. You don't obey an order, you're out of the Navy. That's simple. Yet, President Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy, when he reviewed the case of the soldiers who did go back to work, he reviewed the case of the soldiers who did go back to work, and he concluded that their action was understandable. He recommended leniency. They were still subject to a court-martial, but on lesser charge. And President Roosevelt said that their action was understandable because, he said, they were activated by mass fear. Activated by mass fear. We'll come back to FDR momentarily. He was quite a punster. The mutiny charge, questionable. The mass court-martial, unnecessary. The sailors could have been disciplined without all the bother and fuss. So why go through all the trouble in the middle of the war at that? Two things that bear repeating. Keep these in mind. Number one, the Port Chicago disaster, the story of this mass explosion, historic explosion, unprecedented explosion, is best known as the story of the Port Chicago mutiny. I went to California for one of the anniversary, and I stopped by the Mare Island Museum. A friend of mine was with me. She told the librarian that I was there. I was interested in the Port Chicago disaster. The librarian immediately went to get information on the mutiny trial. In his mind, the story of the Port Chicago disaster was the story of the Port Chicago mutiny trial. When the greatest mass trial in U.S. naval history became headline news across the country, it immediately and permanently upstaged the massive explosion. The mutiny trial upstaged the history of the explosion. The jerry-rigged mutiny trial upstaged the story of the explosion for then and for all time, which may be one reason why most people are unaware that Manhattan Project scientists and engineers working on the design of the atomic bomb studied and relied on the data from the Port Chicago explosion to create the bomb. Now about that. According to William S. Parsons, Port Chicago was designed for large explosions. Port Chicago was designed for large explosions. Now, historians have interpreted that statement to mean that the base was designed to minimize any damages in case of an explosion, which makes sense. After all, that would seem to be the standard operating procedure when designing an ammunition depot where safety would seem to be a concern. But this statement is not just about any ammunition depot. He's talking about Port Chicago, where the known safety hazards went unaddressed, where untrained black sailors, alleged to be of low-quality personnel, handled high explosives without training under the supervision of inexperienced white officers, in some cases racially prejudiced officers, who had them racing to see which division could load the ammunition the fastest. Safety? That was not the concern at Port Chicago. Now, the statement's not coming from just any old source either. This was William S. Parsons speaking. He made this statement in his preliminary memo on the Port Chicago disaster, which is dated July 24th, 1944. Now, on the surface of the memo, it looks like an internal Navy document. It was addressed from William S. Parsons, USN, to Rear Admiral W.R. Purnell, USN, U.S. Navy. What you can't tell from reading the memo, which is appropriately listed among the historic documents on the Manhattan Project at atomicarchive.com, is that Captain Parsons was the head of the Manhattan Project Ordnance Division, the group that created the actual weapon. W.R. Purnell was the Navy representative on the military policy group that advised the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, concerning the bomb. So these aren't just any old body talking. These are people who know what's going on. Now, contrary to reports by historians who say that the Port Chicago explosion wasn't that big of a deal, that Parsons went to Port Chicago out of curiosity and because he was concerned, but contrary to those reports, the Port Chicago explosion was of vital importance to the Manhattan Project. The Port Chicago explosion was of vital importance to the Manhattan Project. It wasn't just historical because it was an unprecedented explosion. It wasn't historical because of the Port Chicago mutiny. The Port Chicago explosion was critical to the development of the atomic bomb. In a 1948 speech to the Naval War College on problems and prospects in atomic energy, Parsons, who by that time had become Rear Admiral Parsons, explained why the Port Chicago explosion was important. It was not until after the explosion of an ammunition ship at Port Chicago in July 1944 that we became realistic in our estimate of the blast damage, he said. And he went on. The naval magazine at Port Chicago had built-in protection against large explosions. He further explained. With some luck, this protection was effective in preventing any secondary explosions or fires. Secondary explosions. With some luck. What's going on here? Let's be straight. Parsons did not study the Port Chicago explosion as a safety officer. He was an experimental engineer leading the urgent effort to design the world's first atomic weapon. Parsons led his team of scientists and engineers to the scene of the explosion for the same reason that scientists studied the effects of the Trinity blast and every other nuclear test, as well as the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In his words, to obtain data on effect rather than the cause of the detonation. Wait a second. To study the effect of the detonation, not the cause of the accident. Most people who are familiar with the Port Chicago disaster assume the explosion was an accident. Now, that is not the conclusion of the court of inquiry that investigated. They came up with 6 possible causes. The least of the likely they ruled out was sabotage, which we'll have to talk about that later in my book. It's not time to go into all of that, but they had 6 possible causes. The second one was indeed that there may have been mishandling, but the first was the possible presence of a super specially sensitive substance. Nobody ever talks about that, though. So, most people familiar with the Port Chicago disaster assume, based on the untrained personnel and the amount of explosives there, they assume that it was an accident. And it's a reasonable assumption, given the high amount of explosives on the on the ship and on the pier, and given the hazardous conditions that had gone unaddressed. The young African-American sailors loading the ships were untrained for the job, which was usually handled by commercial stevedores. Union leaders had even offered to train the Navy personnel, but Navy brass rejected their offer. Safety? Instead, the young sailors loaded ammunition of all conventional kinds, including high explosives, under pressure from inexperienced white officers who sometimes erased them. So, many people describe the base as an accident waiting to happen. Or could it have been an accident designed to happen. Again, we're keeping two things in mind. First, that the mass mutiny trial upstaged the massive explosion. And second, that a year after the Port Chicago explosion, on July 16, 1945, the Trinity test, Manhattan Project leaders used the idea of an explosion at a remote ammunition depot as a cover for a secret nuclear test. Think about it. William S. Parsons is best known as the Navy captain who armed the little boy atomic bomb aboard the Enola Gay as that famous B-29 bomber flew to Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945. That's how he's known. He was the first atomic admiral. He was the man responsible for producing the bomb. He was powerful and well-connected. He played tennis with the Secretary of Navy. But he's best known as for that heroic deed, arming the bomb on that one morning. Before he joined the project in May 1943, Parsons had been instrumental in the development of two other key technologies of World War II, the radar and the proximity fuse, and get this, he had been special assistant to Vannevar Bush. Now, you don't know that, you don't remember that name, but Bush headed the Office of Scientific Research and Development. That was the agency that was administered the Manhattan Project. Now, one thing we need to understand about this agency is that Bush proposed the agency to FDR. FDR signed it and assigned him to head it. It was an independent agency in the executive branch. Bush reported directly to President Roosevelt. There was no congressional oversight. It was kept top secret. And it was Bush who recommended Parsons for the Manhattan Project job. Now, traditional accounts say the Navy was left out of the Manhattan Project, but of course we know now that traditional accounts say a lot of things that just really aren't true. Various reasons are offered to explain this, but since the Navy did make several contributions to the project, including the person who was in charge of delivering the bomb, he created it and delivered it and had many of his officers that he trained to work with him. So since the Navy made so many contributions to the bomb, what's really clear is that it was not the Navy that was left out of the project, it was only left out of the story. And because of this clever omission, one of many, few people realized that the bomb, the atomic bomb, was originally conceived of as a naval weapon. That is clear from one of the first and most famous and most misinterpreted early documents about the bomb, the famous Einstein letter. You've heard of the Einstein letter. Almost every story about the history of the bomb opens with this inaccurate report that the American bomb project was the result of a letter that Albert Einstein wrote to FDR warning him that Germany may be working on an atomic bomb. There are so many things wrong with that story. Historians now agree that, for one thing, the letter was not the catalyst for the bomb at all. And I talk about that more in my book. We can't go into all of that right now, but what we do need to look at is one key phrase in the third paragraph of that letter, where Einstein wrote, well, actually, Einstein didn't write it. He just signed it, but that's another story. In the letter says, a single bomb of this type carried by boat and exploded in a port might very well destroy the whole port together with some of the surrounding territory. However, such bombs might very well prove to be too heavy for transportation by air. That is from the famous Einstein letter that supposedly led to the creation of the atomic bomb. What it shows is that this was the prevailing idea about the bomb in 1939, that it would be carried by boat, and that idea had not yet changed in 1943 when the Los Alamos laboratory got underway with a naval officer, William S. Parsons, in charge of creating the weapon. Now that idea takes on an even more sobering note. A single bomb exploded in a port takes on an even more sobering note in light of one of the findings of the Court of Inquiry that investigated the Port Chicago explosion. They spoke of what happened to the E.A. Bryan. The locations of fragments indicate that the explosives in the E.A. Bryan exploded as one large bomb. Of course, that could be coincidental. And if so, then there's many similar coincidences that I discovered in my investigation of the Port Chicago nuclear explosion theory. What most people also don't know, and there's many of these things that people don't know and uncovered by this research, but one of them things is that the first atomic weapon was not the little boy bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, nor was it the Trinity, the plutonium implosion bomb that was detonated at the Trinity test. The world's first atomic weapon model was the Thin Man plutonium assembly gun model that was shelved by Manhattan Project leaders meeting at the University of Chicago on July 17, 1944. On July 17, 1944, the day of the Port Chicago explosion, Manhattan Project leaders met across the country at the University of Chicago to decide on the fate of the very first atomic bomb, which we know so little about, in which there are no fragments in museums, although it was the world's first atomic weapon. The Thin Man. William S. Parsons, head of ordnance, had been working on this project since he joined the project. He had been working on the Thin Man since he joined the project in May or June of 1943. A year later, 13 months later, 14 months later, on July 17, 1944, his primary project is discontinued, and he was absent from the meeting. He was absent from the meeting. Why? Nothing is said about it. It's not mentioned that he was absent. It's not mentioned where he was. But the answer might be found in a letter he wrote in September 1944, where he used the clear and explicit phrase, "From my observation of the Port Chicago explosion." From my observation of the Port Chicago explosion. There's something going on here, because there is so much more that we don't know about that I discovered in my research of the Port Chicago nuclear explosion theory. Secrets that affect us to this day. Secrets that affect nuclear policy. Secrets that affect the military budget. Secrets that affect how we perceive America, American history, African American history, the story of the bomb, the benefits and importance of the bomb. Secrets, lies. In 1993, Lawrence Badash, then a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, and Richard G. Hewlett, then a chief historian of the Atomic Energy Commission, wrote a scathing review of the Port Chicago nuclear explosion theory as expounded by Peter Vogel, and they dismissed his 11-year-old article as a story too good to kill. But from my observation of the evidence concerning the connection between the Port Chicago disaster and the Manhattan Project, I am convinced that nearly 80 years after the explosion and 40 years after Vogel's original article, the Port Chicago nuclear explosion theory is too important to ignore. So I invite you to learn more about it in my books, American Nuclear Deception and Designed for Large Explosions. I'm Daisy Brown Herndon. Thanks for listening.